welcome to another seminar at ArC. As usual, we invite two speakers that present two different approaches to one question related to art and aesthetics. Our aim with this seminar series is to create a space where we can facilitate and promote a true multidisciplinary discourse. And today we'll be engaging in a conversation about fashion from the point of view of both theology and psychology. Our first speaker today is Dr. Robert Covolo, who currently works with church relations at the Center for Faith and Work in Los Angeles, and he is the director of the Pastoral Residency Center at Christ Church, Sierra Madre. His doctoral studies focused on theology and culture alongside dogmatics and economics. So his recent book, Fashion Theology, pioneers the relationship between fashion and Christian theology. So Robert, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Marina. Do I start talking now?
Yes, sure. I'm Nicole.
Okay, great. Oh, sorry, Nicole. Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Carolyn, for joining me as well in this conversation. I'm looking forward to it very much, and greetings to everyone from Los Angeles. In 2009, I had just returned from yet another fashion week in New York when I stumbled upon an essay written 160 years ago by a 19th century theologian discussing the relationship between fashion, modernism, and secularization. And I was both shocked that such a conversation was happening 160 years ago, and I was absolutely spellbound. You know, fashion studies is a relatively young discipline, maybe we could say a half century old. And of course, people have been writing about dress much longer than that. But in terms of like a self-identified approach to thinking about dress and fashion, it's a relatively young discipline. And to think that you know, here 160 years ago, there was this theologian thinking about fashion's relationship to modernism and secularization really surprised me. And then as I began to dive in, it really opened up a whole world to me that I found out had yet to be really treated with any kind of substantial engagement. And that was the surprising relationship between theology and fashion. And so that discovery launched me into a decade-long project exploring this relationship between theology and fashion, and the fruit of which was my 2020 book, Fashion Theology. And I'll have more to say about what I found as I retraced the way theologians engage fashion throughout the centuries. But before I jump in the talk, though, I should say a brief word about the prompt we've been given. The prompt was this. Our fashion is one of the most significant cultural phenomena of our times, but can fashion influence our moods and communicate cultural status? So the talk today, the talks have been framed around this question, this statement / question. Fashion is one of the most significant cultural phenomena of our times. That's a statement. Can fashion influence our moods and communicate cultural status? So I've been asked to approach this question from the lens of Christian theology. And what I want to do in the few minutes that I have been allotted is I want to draw attention to two components of this question. First, I want to briefly address if theology agrees with the claim that fashion is a significant cultural phenomenon. Okay, so I don't want to just assume that. I'm approaching this from the lens of theology. Does theology agree with this? And then second, I want to offer a theological assessment of this two-part question. Does fashion influence our moods, and can fashion communicate cultural status? So that's where I'm going today. And my purpose, what I really desire, as I thought about what do I hope is going to happen as a result of my talk, it's pretty simple. I'm hoping to give a couple of examples or tease out a few things to demonstrate that the relationship between theology and fashion is far more interesting and dynamic than we might suspect. You know, theology is neither the enemy nor the friend of fashion, but maybe the best way to say it is more like a conflicted sibling. You know, siblings, they have similarities, and yet they're different in ways in those similarities. And, you know, so that's what I'm thinking or hoping that we'll be able to see as a result of this. All right, well, let's, with no further ado, I want to start by briefly addressing this claim that fashion is a significant cultural phenomena from the vantage point of Christian theology. I want to talk about that. And does theology believe fashion is one of the most significant cultural phenomena of our times? I think that descriptively, most theologians, and here I'm thinking about my peers, would acknowledge that fashion has colonized a large section of late modern Western imaginations and indeed is a global phenomenon, and it's hard to miss that. But speaking prescriptively, I would also say that I think most contemporary theologians would not see fashion as a subject worthy of significant theological engagement. Theologians are more likely to see fashion as frivolous. They might be quick to dismiss fashion, or worse, see it as a vice that must be overcome. And there is a long history to this kind of approach. It starts with some of the early patristic fathers. Tertullian, I think, is one of the strongest voices that kind of launched this anti-adornment rhetoric. And it's witnessed in maybe a more contemporary example is Margaret Miles, who writes a lot about the understanding of the body and embodiedness. And yet in her book, Bodies in Society, Essays on Christianity and Contemporary Culture, when she picks up the subject of fashion, she sees it primarily through the lens of inscribing upon the body certain vices such as consumerism and vanity and so forth. So this dismissive reaction by contemporary theologians of fashion is surprising in my mind, given my discovery that I hinted at, namely that when you actually go back through the history of theology, there has been a strong voice. In fact, many major theologians have taken fashion quite serious. And this is the big shocker of my book, is that, it's one of these things you launch off on something, you don't know what you're going to find, and what you find really surprises you. And I'm not going to go into great detail. The book does that. But I do want to show just a couple of examples of how fashion has been taken very serious by theologians within their particular fashion dispensation. And those of you in fashion studies know that fashion has gone through different dispensations, and it does so also in light of different cultural contexts. But within the West, when we think of fashion and its dispensations, and we think of theologians, we see them addressing fashion uniquely within their context. St. Augustine, who I think is arguably the first fashion theorist, sincerely believe that, in 397 was addressing the fledgling fashion system of the late Roman Empire. And he applied his considerable work in semiotics to speak of dress as operating like a complex language with countless coded meanings. That's his words, countless coded meanings that are to help complex societies function. So, when I started writing, one of my mentors encouraged me, he's a fashion theorist, encouraged me to show how theology and fashion have nothing in common. They don't even get each other. And actually, my project came forth with the idea that actually the first fashion theorist was a theologian. So it's a very different idea. But Augustine offers some very profound insights there in 397 in interacting with and there were kind of fledgling fashion codes within the late Roman Empire, not so much the early Republic. When we jump ahead to the 13th century to northern Italy, where many fashion theorists believe we see the rise of fashion, at least modern fashion, beginning. In fact, it's been pinpointed to northern Italy, and there's reasons for that. But lo and behold, we also find in northern Italy at the same time Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian Aquinas. And he pays attention to the shifting nature of dress. And in fact, in the Summa, he dedicates a considerable section explaining and exploring whether and how virtue ethics might apply to the shifting nature of dress. And I think it's right to translate what he's talking about there as fashion. We can jump up to the 20th century, and there we witness the great Swiss Reformed theologian Karl Barth, and a fascinating little piece of information that most Barth scholars don't know is that Barth cut his teeth as a young pastor spearheading a fight to unionize the local textile industry. Barth was all too aware of how fashion can be a source for invasive market forces that dominate our lives, and when unchecked, can be the conveyors of consumerism and care little for the workers who must slave away to produce goods, which is a very contemporary and relevant theme today. Yet surprisingly, Barth does not sound simply a note of warning about fashion, but he sees it as this unspoken confession that we all make, that we have a desire for some kind of glory, some kind of more for our bodies, for ourselves. And in fact, the idea that fashion draws off our intrinsic sense that we were made for more is not only at the heart of Barth's appraisal of the religious psychology of fashion, but is spoken of time at a time time and time again by theologians across the centuries. If there was one theme that the collective theological voice has across the centuries, is that our engagement with dress finds its distinctly religious impulse in this kind of tacit, unspoken confession that we all desire for us to be glorious. We all desire for us to be something more, for us to explore that there's something here that fascinates us with our own selves, and there is a hope implicit in that as we engage with the aesthetics of the body. And so, and indeed, this thought takes us back to Christianity's inception. St. Paul says we were made to put on Jesus Christ. That's a phrase that Paul likes to use, putting on Christ. We were made for glory, and the great hope of the Christian faith from its earliest inception is that we will be clothed differently. And Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, we will all be changed in an instant, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. And every time you get up in the morning, you will be changed, right? And so for the perishable must be clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. So there you have, I believe, one of the very kind of sources of this psychological insight, that there is this hope for something more. And that hope for something more, I think, is another way of saying that an immanent frame is incapable of establishing and nurturing the deepest hopes we have about the future of our own future. I hope these brief vignettes will suffice to show that theologians have historically paid attention to dress, even fashionable dress. And in fact, I wrote Fashion Theology really as an intramural discussion on one level. I wanted fellow theologians to see the significance of fashion. I also wanted fashion theorists to see the significance of theology, but I was speaking, at least in the first half of the book, primarily to my peers. So I'm in strong agreement that fashion is a serious cultural phenomenon, and this is where I think Carolyn and I are going to find a lot of mutuality. But what are we to make of this phenomena, and how are we to understand it from a theological point of view? This leads me to two questions that were put forward that are side by side. Can fashion influence our moods, and can it communicate cultural status? And let's just take each one at a time. So this is the second point of the talk. There'll be 3 points. It's very, very simple. I learned, keep it simple if you're just giving an auditory talk. So does fashion influence our moods? And I think the answer, and again, I'm sure for Carolyn as well, the answer is resoundingly yes. The more interesting question, implicit in this question, is how does it influence our moods? And I believe there's a number of reasons why it influences our moods, and I'm not going to attempt to go into all of those reasons. Maybe some more will emerge in the conversation. But I do want to draw attention to one of the reasons why I believe fashion has such a powerful influence on our moods. And then I want to show how this idea overlaps with theological thought. Within fashion theory, there have largely been 2 dispensations. The first dispensation was dominated by the question of communication. And we see this actually in Roland Barthes' semiotic approach to fashion in his book, The Fashion System. Here Barthes sees fashion as serving as a superb, I would say, illustration of his structuralist approach to semiotics, which incidentally Barthes then later on, stepped away from. So I'm not sure where that leaves fashion. But the damage was done, and for the next 30 plus years, the fashion theory was dominated with questions of communication. And the idea of fashion as communication, I would say, reaches its high watermark in the work of my doctoral mentor, Malcolm Bernard, who in 2013 published his book, Fashion is Communication, and it went on to a second edition in 2002. That was the first dispensation of fashion theory, according to my lights. The second dispensation emerged in 2000 with Joan Entwistle's book, The Fashioned Body. And Entwistle's major contribution, as I see it, was she shifted the discussion from how fashion communicates to the body as a site of knowledge and the way fashion interacts with the body. And her aim is to address the body, as she does, by discussing the body not only as a cultural object, but as a way of knowing. And in fact, one of her sections is called Merleau-Ponty and Embodiment. And most of our knowledge, basically, according to Merleau-Ponty, and Entwistle then brings us out, resides somewhere between the brain and the body. It's precognitive. It's a sense that is closely tied to the body. And therefore, our way of knowing the world predominantly is much more closer to a mood or an affective mode than mere either sensation, which would be purely just the body, or cognition, which would be purely the mind or brain. As a result, the visceral comportment of dress is known by the body as the body knows. In fact, it is our habituation of rituals that create the fundamental ways we navigate life, that create the structures. This is kind of some basic kind of embodied knowledge kind of theory. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the way we navigate the world, how we drive a car, how we appreciate music, how we attend a graduate seminar online, is driven in large parts by ways of knowing that are not primarily cognitive, but they're working on an acognitive registrar. And that is the way, when we wear something, we create a certain kind of sensory experience that the body has. And that then plays into this form of knowing, this precognitive form of knowing, which we might say is very close to mood. So what does this have to do with theology? Well, the turn to the body has been welcomed within theological studies. Frankly, theology has been doing this, again, much longer than the current epistemic turn. To quote Pascal, the heart has reasons that reason knows not of. Ritual studies has long played an important role in liturgical theology, in fact, from its inception, because liturgical theology is all about the way ritual then shapes us as human beings. So when we think of the famous engagement between Catholic liturgical theologian Aidan Kavanagh and ritual studies scholar Ronald Grimes, we see that there is this great discussion and sometimes tension between ritual studies and theology. And more recently, the strong connection between rituals of worship and knowing has been developed with philosophical and theological precision by Christian philosopher Jamie Smith in his Imagining the Kingdom, How Worship Works, where he draws on Bourdieu's understanding of habitus and Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception in order to talk about how bodily comportment is critical for knowing. And in fact, in that book, he has a section, this is a book on worship, and in that book, he has a section talking about how the corset then shapes the way in which people could know within the Victorian world. So, this isn't a theology book. So there's deep crossover. Theology for a long time has been talking about the importance of understanding the body as its own site of knowledge. And once again, this brings us back to the inception of Christianity. As the Apostle Paul says, I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. 1 Corinthians 9:27. This is a profound text because Paul here is recognizing that all his preaching is pointless if he does not take his body serious as a source of knowing that has its own voice. He may know the gospel good and well in his head as a Jew who is informed by the Old Testament scriptures, who is a person on mission and an apostle, but his body might still be pagan. He may think he's fighting a great fight to get the gospel out to an unbelieving world, but his body has its own way of knowing and influence. And so fashion does influence our moods because fashion influences the body, and the body is a critical site for precognitive perceptions, which I think are important for most of the way we navigate the world. And I'm sure Carolyn will have a lot more to add to that, and also I'm sure I can learn a lot more from her on that subject. So yes, it does influence our moods. I would also want to add, and maybe we can come back to this in the conversation, I think it influences our moods also in a very profound way because we are narrative creatures. And so I'll just leave that dangling there. Can fashion communicate cultural status? Okay, this is the final question I want to answer. One way to read this final question is to think in terms of class. And of course, fashion has long been associated with class and class struggle. And Veblen, of course, is the name of the person that drew this out the most. And seeing fashion really is this great game of keeping up with the Joneses in terms of trying to always move outside of your class. Okay, that's one way of reading this question, but I actually believe it's phrased in a more interesting way. And so I want to take this question in a broader, more global sense so as to point out the theological real estate that is for sale in terms of fashion and cultural status. And here's how I'm going to understand this question. Does the presence and role of fashion in a culture tell us something interesting about a culture's status? And if so, does this have theological interest? Now, this takes me back to that lecture I discovered by that Dutch theologian who 160 years ago was discussing the relationship between fashion and modernism and secularization. He saw fashion not merely as a neutral cultural facet, nor as simply a manifestation of psychological needs, nor purely in economic terms, though it can be assessed in all of those different lenses and, of course, more. But he also saw it as a cultural force that shapes us, and that this shaping has theological implications. Now, to do justice to how fashion shapes us and has been deeply a part of the rise of modern secularism, I would have to assign everybody a short reading in Charles Taylor's The Secular Age, which is only 900 pages. And I mentioned that book because Taylor takes fashion very serious also. He has serious, significant sections where he sees fashion as deeply connected to the rise of secularization and secularism. But for our short time, I'll have to point out two ways fashion carries with it a certain secular impulse. And then I just want to say a brief word about whether or not this is a defeater for fashion as a sort of source for transcendence. First, fashion shapes our relationship to the now. In an age of fashion, the new and the now have a certain kind of freight or a certain kind of weight. You know, when you think about the word modernity, where does the word modernity come from? Well, fashion theorists like to point out that the word modernity literally comes from the Latin root word modo, from which we get the word fashion. The word modo, it means immediately present, that which is right now. And so to say that we live in the modern age is to say we live in a period when we place weight on that which is right now, that which is most immediate. Cultural historians recognize that in the transition from early modernity to mid-modernity, Western civilization shifted like a giant psychological shift from privileging the past to privileging the present. And I would say in late modernity, we privilege the very immediate, that which is new and now, with a certain kind of abandonment. And this is all the more so with our growing technologies. And so all things being equal, we see that which is new and now as superior to anything that has come before it. And I think it can be argued that this impulse to so heavily freight that which is most immediate without recourse to any kind of influences our way of understanding the world, such that we tend to operate without recourse to any larger arc of history. And so, of course, the great Western religions think of time in terms of meta-narratives, not just religions, but I would say like secular religions like Marxism and stuff like that do as well. And to the degree that fashion helps bind our modern imagination such that we can't think beyond framing our narratives from birth to death, or worse, beyond the next haul of cool consumer goods, to that degree, fashion is a cultural force for secularization or secularism. And so now I think that actually fashion is more than that. And I'm going to come back to that. But I think that it does have within it certain tendencies. And I think that's part, in my own understanding, we can talk about this, about the provenance of fashion, how deeply it arose with the West, even though it's a global phenomenon, clearly, and embeds itself in different cultures. So the first point is can fashion communicate cultural status? And my answer is yes. It can tell us about a culture because it is a force in its own right that shapes our way of understanding our relationship to time and where we sit. The second thing I want to point out, and I'll kind of conclude with this, is fashion tends to favor a certain way of understanding identity. You know, in Calvin's Institutes, he starts it off like this: knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves are intimately connected, such that you can't have knowledge of one without knowledge of the other. Now, think about what Calvin left out. What Calvin left out is social identity. Calvin doesn't even mention, how others know us. How God knows me is so deeply connected with how I know myself. So Calvin's dealing with the psychology of the self and the theology, right? But he leaves out the sociology. And what is Calvin doing here? Calvin is simply drawing from Augustine's Confessions, where Augustine goes on a long journey to know himself by virtue of praying through his own autobiography. And why does Augustine do this? Well, Augustine believes he's going to find himself when he brings himself before the mind that knows all things. And only as he brings himself before a mind that knows himself better than he can know himself can he truly know himself. And so, yes, he looks within, and Augustine in the Confessions, does this tremendous deep dive into himself. Really, it's kind of the founding of modern psychology in many ways. He's definitely a father of autobiography, but he does it in a way that's deeply theological. He's not taking the journey inward alone. Augustine is looking within to find himself, but he's doing this with God through prayer. Now, modern expressionism, the idea that I look deep within myself to see what impulses I have and bring those to the surface, and sometimes we talk about you need to express yourself in what you wear, is a deeply Augustinian impulse, but it's an Augustinian heresy in that it's unhinged from one of the main missing actors, which is God. and Kierkegaard recognized that in the modern period, we tend to weigh our sense of identity in light of our sociology such that we are tempted to find ourselves outside ourselves. In fact, this is Kierkegaard's great warning. Be careful you don't find yourself outside yourself. The self-reflexive self can't help but think about itself in relationship to other selves. And I do think this is part of creation. I think it's actually in the Genesis account. But it is never apart from belief in a mind that actually exists above and beyond my own mind or other minds and can see myself better than I can see myself. And if indeed there is such a mind, and I'm not assuming there is, of course I'm a theologian, so you can guess where I fall down on the existence of God. But what I do want to say is that if there is such a mind, then of course that mind would weigh into the identity question far more than any other source, including social identity markers. Or to quote 1 Samuel 16:7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And the point here, actually, the story is really quite entertaining. They're looking for a king. Of course, he goes and he finds all the good-looking guys that should be king that would match up with, all the expectations, the social expectations, and God's like, nope. This ruddy little shepherd boy, that's the one I want because I can see things differently and I see actually who this person really is and their character. So fashion invites us to define our identity in terms of social identity. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying that's terrible. I do believe that part of our own identity is always embedded in how others perceive us. And that is actually part of the way the world is made. And it's actually deeply Trinitarian. But to the degree it becomes reductive, it invites us to play with our identity as something that is merely an expression of the lone self into the inner caverns and the loud voices that we find within our current sociology. All right, let me bring the horses back into the stable. I do not believe that fashion is necessarily purely secular. And one of the questions I'll have for Carolyn is she talks about it is yet to be seen whether or not fashion can be a carrier of transcendence, which I really, I like that she put that there. And I think that's an important question we can raise. But I do think that fashion in many ways is as conflicted with theological belief as the modern period is. In fact, because fashion, I think in many ways is so deeply a manifestation of modernity, it carries with it all of the possibilities and all of the hazards in terms of theological thought in our fragilized world, where belief is deeply fragilized. So, of course, we've only scratched the surface here. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and my desire was merely to begin the conversation. I hope that people will disagree or engage, but all I wanted to do right here is simply point out that theology has had a voice in this discussion from the beginning. In fact, it can be argued that maybe theology started this conversation of fashion studies and fashion theory long before the formal emergence of the discipline. And theologians have seen fashion as a significant cultural phenomena that deserves careful attention. I'm hoping that my peers will join me, and it's encouraging. I did have a graduate seminar on fashion and theology at one Christian graduate place in Toronto. I have another one coming up this winter, and there's a series of dissertations that are being written right now by theologians on fashion that I'm aware of. So there is a movement afoot. I hope that fashion theorists will begin to take theology serious. I think they're actually already doing it, but they don't know that. And anyways, secondly, I just want to say that I've offered initial theological engagement on this two-part question. Does fashion influence our moods? Can fashion communicate cultural status? And I'm hoping that, that there's far more that we might talk about, but maybe what I've done, and my hope was purely this, to see that theology and fashion are not enemies, they're not best friends, they're more like conflicted siblings. You know, fashion speaks about identity and time and the body, but theology speaks about identity and time and the body as well. And sometimes they disagree and sometimes they don't. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very interesting. Now, just my comment to the audience, please write down your questions, not to forget them, because during the discussion you'll have a chance, everyone will have a chance to ask Robert a question or give him a comment on his very interesting talk. Now, our second speaker is Professor Carolyn Mair. Fashion is one of her main research interests. Professor Mair created the world's first psychology for fashion master's degree at the University of Arts, London. She's currently an independent scholar who founded her own consulting agency. She has worked with many different fashion brands, including the H&M Group. In 2018, she published a book, The Psychology of Fashion. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Professor Mair. We look forward to hear your talk.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, Marina and Nicole. I'm going to share my screen now because I do have slides. So hopefully that will share. Okay. Please tell me when you can see it. Are you able to see?
Yes, we can see. Great.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So, yeah, I was tasked with the same statement and questions as Robert was, which are very, very interesting and challenging from a psychological perspective. But many of the things that Robert had said, he could replace theology with psychology. So I think we will share a lot of commonalities as we come together to discuss after my talk. So I'm going to start now with this slide, which comes from the Google site, We Wear Culture, which you haven't visited yet. I strongly recommend you do. It was created in 2017. It's still available. And it's an online experience combining 3,000 years of fashion history with stories behind the clothing that we wear. For example, it looks at how Chanel's black dress changed the association that we have with the color black from a sign of mourning, certainly in some countries, I know this is not universal, but to a classic staple, to an association with sophistication and sexiness. And now the black dress is known as the LBD, the little black dress. It also shows how Marilyn Monroe's red stilettos became a symbol of empowerment and sexiness for women worldwide, and how Vivienne Westwood views the corset in a way that we might not immediately associate with our cultural understandings of corset. Google Arts and Culture wanted to show that fashion is much deeper than just what we wear, that fashion is influenced by art, music, and culture more broadly. And also by theology, and as we'll see, by psychology. And the fantastic resources is available still at g.co/wewearculture. And what I think the site shows very much is that fashion is a significant cultural phenomenon of our times now, but also of previous times. And fashion as a cultural phenomenon has been studied and analysed by fashion theorists, sociologists and anthropologists, and as I'm learning, also by theologians. And according to anthropologists, all known human cultures dress the body in some way. For example, through clothing, tattooing, cosmetics, or other forms of body painting or adornment. We wear clothes because they protect, adorn, accentuate, and conceal our bodies, as well as because they are an expression of who we are and who we want to be and who we want to be perceived as. In his 2013 book, The Language of Fashion, Roland Barthes claimed that clothing concerns all the human person, all the body, all of the relationships of man to body, as well as the relationships of body to society. But it's impossible to separate clothing from the body And of course, the body encapsulates the self. But until recently, psychologists have not engaged with fashion, like theologians, as a focus of research. But also, like Robert, more and more since I began the course at London College of Fashion, University of the Arts London, in 2014, when the course first started running, it itself, or fashion psychology, is becoming also a global phenomenon, which I'm extremely excited about. So let's move on to the next slide. So fashion and the body. Entwistle talks about the body as if it's separate from the brain. But psychologists would all agree that the brain does not operate in isolation from the body. The mind-body disparity has long been debunked in psychology. We understand that the brain is a part of a system of the whole. And it's not just the body. So we talk about embodied cognition, embodied embodied cognition, but that also includes the environment as well. So we understand cognition does not only take place in the brain. So when we talk about fashion and the body, we really must understand and talk about psychology, or include psychology at least. So fashion is our second skin. It's the closest object to our bodies. The feeling that we get from fashion impacts us both physically and psychologically. When we feel good, we project a more positive image that allows us to look good, or to be perceived as looking good by others. The word feel describes both physical and psychological sensation. And we feel physically through the sense of touch, which signals weight, texture, and temperature differently on different parts of the body. And even at a subconscious level, touch influences emotion, which influences behavior. So we may be touched very briefly in a way that we may not consciously perceive, and yet that can influence our liking for another person or not. And we're able to distinguish a variety of emotional aspects of communication through touch. And remember that our clothing, our fashion, touches us. It's the closest thing to our body. So these emotional aspects enable us to develop a deeper sense of connection with others. The human touch, which makes us like the toucher more. But researchers found that, like sensation in general, touch does not operate in isolation. So our interpretation of the touch is ultimately determined by our evaluation of the person or the object that is touching us, and other variables. Our experience, for example. Initially, this depends on the object or the person's appearance. And appearance is mostly about fashion when we talk about people, because clothing, hair, cosmetics, footwear, gloves, jewelry, as well as tattoos and scent, are now part of the fashion empire. And when we think about this, when Marilyn Monroe was asked what she wore to bed, she replied, Chanel No. 5. So recently, and during the pandemic, this idea of fashion influencing our mood, or using fashion to make us feel better, has really come to the fore. And I myself have been asked several times to talk about fashion as a way of feeling good, fashion as a way of making us feel good about ourselves. And I was interested to hear Robert mention this basic need to be the best we can be, to hope for something more. And this is a fundamental, again, psychological need. And this came from a recent article that I was cited in, Why Dopamine Dressing is the Feel-Good Fashion Trend We Need in 2021. And I should point out here that this is a misunderstanding of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is commonly thought of the pleasure neurotransmitter, but it is the brain's most common neurotransmitter, and it's involved in multiple brain processes, including decision making, by alerting us to the salient information that comes to us through our senses from the environment. and also from our memories.
It definitely can happen, especially over Teams. So
Yeah, normally it doesn't. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I'll go back and read, and you can tell me to stop or hurry up or whatever. So, I don't know where I was on the dopamine dressing. I'll just start again at that slide. So did I talk about how it's not the reward neurotransmitter rather than the pleasure one? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go on with the next part of that. Different brands promote different lifestyles. So when we talk about dopamine dressing, we talk about enhancing our social status and social responsibility. For example, Supreme cultivates a sort of aloofness, which its customers can only aspire to. This manipulative marketing, which it is, taps into the dopamine dressing idea because we get more pleasure from the chase than from the catch. And Chanel promotes a timeless elegance and femininity, so that even if we buy into the Chanel brand, we might just buy a lipstick, for example. We're buying into that kind of identity. Christopher Kane likes to be irreverent. Well, I can't speak now. With his designs, and they're very noticeable and striking when you see them, and identifiable. Of course, our interpretation of a brand depends on many factors, though, including how involved we are with fashion, our knowledge, and our motivation to care. And what we wear is an expression of who we are. So now I'm looking at fashion and identity, and I also feel that it's interesting to hear Robert talk about the founding father almost of theology was also interested in fashion. The founding father of psychology, William James, also spoke about fashion. So in the 1890s, when psychology was beginning to be born, William James spoke about fashion is part of who we are. It's part of our identity, along with our home, our families, the things that matter to us. Fashion expresses who we are. And we see that now. Fashion enables us to negotiate our identity, to change who we want to be seen as, and to tell ourselves and try to tell others where we fit in. So this is our social identity. And I see social identity as a psychological construct as well as a sociological construct. And fashion is also an expression of our desired outcome, but it's more complicated than that because we make judgments about whether we like a person or not in under a second, based on their appearance alone, and then we seek evidence to support that judgment. So if our initial judgment is positive, we also adorn them with positive psychological qualities that we couldn't possibly know through appearance alone. This is known as the halo effect. And sadly, the reverse is also true. And compared with what are considered less attractive people, good-looking people tend to be more successful. They're judged more favorably and treated better. And shockingly, but not surprisingly, juries are less likely to find attractive people guilty. And when they do, they recommend lighter punishments. And when we think how much of our appearance is fashion, we have to consider the impact of this in the forensic landscape as well. So clearly fashion allows us to fit in and stand out with social groups. These groups are determined by social norms. And identities are dynamic. And so a strategic person will manage their appearance to achieve the desired outcomes that they want, using fashion to facilitate social identification and social cohesion. Consciously choosing specific clothing or specific branded clothing allows the wearer to demonstrate their values, or if it's a brand, their shared values and the brand's personality. This can boost self-esteem and well-being through the sense of belonging to this social group. and aligning our values with them, as well as simultaneously being distinct from other social groups and brands considered less desirable. So fashion is increasingly influenced by consumers, and more recently, instead of pushing out ideas and fashion assortment to customers, brands are pulling in designs from local communities and subcultures. And one of my favorite fashion reference books is Daniele Tagmani's Fashion Tribes, which is a result of that's where I am, of travels around the world to find and record international fashion subcultures. And there are images in the book of heavy metal rockers in Botswana, hipsters in Johannesburg, dandies in the Congo, female wrestlers in Bolivia, bling bling youth in Cuba, and punks in Burma. These groups are often marginalized in their own societies, and they retaliate through consciously expressing their personal style through their fashion. And we see this in music as well. We see how music genres align through their fashion. Of course, things always don't play out as we intend, because non-verbal communication through fashion, like any language, can be misunderstood. So I look now at fashion as communication, and I was delighted to hear that Malcolm Barnard was a mentor on your PhD, Robert, because I absolutely love the book Fashion as Communication. So yeah, I talk about it a lot in my own book. So yeah, amazing to hear that. So what we wear reflects how we want to be seen, but that isn't necessarily the same as how we are seen, because that depends on the wearer's on the viewer's perception and their individual differences and preferences, and all sorts of the other factors that go around this: context, environment, so on. Imagine that you're on a first date in a very fancy restaurant with candlelight and wine, and you're sitting waiting for your date to come. When they walk in the door, they're wearing a white t-shirt and tie-up Balenciaga sneakers. What does this tell you about the person? Well, if you're a high-end streetwear, you know about this, you follow this, you're likely familiar with the fact that these shoes cost a lot of money, maybe over £1,000. And that the word Balenciaga printed on the sides of the shoes means that they're designer. You're likely to assume that this person, your date, is from a higher economic status, or at least that they try to communicate this. But if you're not immersed in the world of designer streetwear, perhaps you would have liked them to dress more formally, to wear something more that you would have chosen. And you might be surprised that they've turned up dressed the way they are. You may even be unimpressed. So communication through fashion is as subjective as communicating in any other language. And I believe, like Barnard, that fashion has syntax, it has vocabulary, it has sentences as you like. So putting our clothes together is a form of language. And as any form of language, it can easily be misunderstood. But we use fashion as communication, and consciously doing this by tapping in to the socio-cultural associations that we have with particular fashion. So think about Mark Zuckerberg, who's well known for wearing a t-shirt, hoodie and jeans to work every day. That's his work uniform, he says, because it allows him to express who he is and get on better with the problems at hand. But when he tested before the US House Financial Services Committee, he chose to wear a suit and tie. So he did this because he wanted to make an impression. It was no accident. Formal suits are associated with professionalism and conscientiousness, and the effect influences not only the perceiver's perception of us, but it affects our own behavior. So that when we wear formal clothes, such as a business suit, we consider ourselves more professional, and we actually behave in a more professional, I'm doing inverted commas here because that's open to interpretation, in a more professional way. Other research demonstrating the influence of what we wear on behavior demonstrates this also. So people wearing glasses are more likely to be considered diligent and conscientious than non-wearers. and the simultaneous acts of wearing glasses, even if they're only cosmetic, and believing that they make you conscientious and diligent, can make the wearer really be more conscientious. So this demonstrates how we can make fashion work for us by engaging with what we're wearing and consciously, and I say consciously here, I'm emphasizing that, considering its symbolic meaning, we can enhance how we feel, we can change our mood and how we perform, and we can also change how others feel about us. And this was demonstrated very neatly in a study at Northwestern University in 2012, when psychologists ran a study where they'd predetermined that lab coats are associated with attention and care. And the psychologists gave participants an identical lab coat, but told some that their coats were doctor's coats and some that they were wearing painter's coats. And they ran several studies, but I'll cut this study short. It's fairly well known now, so you may already know it. I see Nicole nodding her head, so I know you're familiar with this one. But the outcome was that those who wore the supposed doctor's coats performed better on attention tests than the others, on a series of attention tests, I should say here, different types of attention. And the researchers concluded that the simultaneous experience of wearing certain clothes and the symbolic meaning that we assign to those clothes affects our cognitive processes. And they called this concept enclothed cognition. So taking the concept of embodied cognition a step further to include brain processes. And there are several other studies showing the power of clothing on others as well as ourselves. And I'll talk about this one very, very briefly, and then this is the end. But there was a study where researchers showed images of an individual wearing different coloured T-shirts and asked raters to choose the most attractive image. So the same individual in different coloured T-shirts. The image wearing the wearer wearing a red T-shirt was selected as the most attractive. And this is unsurprising because we have many socio-cultural associations with red as being attractive, for passion, for sexiness, and for love. But what is exciting is that when the researchers presented the raters with monochrome images, so they became a different grayscale images, different raters still rated the image of the wearer who had been wearing the red T-shirt, but they couldn't see it as red, as more attractive. And the researchers argued that the wearer felt more attractive wearing the red T-shirt, and this came through in her appearance. So when I've spoken about this before, everybody rushes out and buys a red T-shirt. But the researchers argued that this shows how fashion can influence how we feel. And I strongly believe, and I stand by this belief, that how we feel influences how we look far more than the reverse. Because we see this, that how fashion influences our mood when we have healthy psychology, when we are mentally healthy. But when we're in a clinically depressed state or experiencing serious mental health issues, we could not care less about what we're wearing. So this tells me we have that power. We have that power there to make fashion work for us. So I'd sum up very quickly in 2 sentences. Without doubt, fashion is one of the most significant cultural phenomena of our times. Totally agree. It can and does far more than just influence our mood and communicate cultural status. It interacts in complex ways with how we think and act and impacts our motivations, interactions, and outcomes. And I would say fashion is psychology because it's the closest things to our body. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was very interesting, and I am personally very surprised how many interactions both your talks have. So you might want to comment on that, both of you, if you want to. Robert, you as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Carolyn. I really, really enjoyed your talk, and it's bringing it all back because I haven't been trafficking in the fashion studies research for a while. I've been kind of in other worlds recently, but I always enjoy thinking about how profound fashion is. And of course, you've just opened up only one venue, right? The psychology of fashion. And of course, all the soft sciences have developed a language about fashion. And so it's wonderful to have an expert here on the psychology of fashion interacting and talking about our mood. And what I would like to maybe ask you is, how do you see fashion playing a role in our everyday kind of emplotment? And maybe also, and I threw this question out there ahead of time, I'm not sure if you received it, but I'm very interested in the subconscious. As a theologian, I think that you have to believe in the subconscious. That the heart it has its own kind of levels and layers, and that you can oftentimes find yourself doing things that you're not consciously aware that you're doing, right? Which is that's a huge principle in psychology. Yeah. So I would love for you to maybe comment a little bit about kind of how fashion operates on the subconscious level, and then how does fashion play a role in kind of our narrative construal and understandings of ourselves as narrative creatures?
Right, interesting. So on a subconscious level, most of our behavior is subconscious or driven by the subconscious. So this is why I emphasize conscious when I was speaking so much, because clearly, like you said, Robert, we get changed. We change every day. We change our clothing every day, or maybe not, but we change our clothes every day. Let's say we change, but we don't always do it consciously. Sometimes we just I do, put a hand in a drawer and pull out the first t-shirt that I find and put that on. But that still sends out communication. That still says something about me. But when I consciously choose something to wear, I am at least having some control over the outcome I want to have, or the identity I want to portray. So for example, I wasn't wearing this denim t-shirt before I joined this talk. I love denim. I wear denim. Kind of that's my uniform. But I was wearing a jumper because it was quite cold, and I didn't particularly like that jumper. And I wanted to put on this denim t-shirt because I think it shows who I am, which is informal and casual, and I hope approachable. And that kind of, for me, that's what denim signifies. So we absolutely operate on a subconscious level the majority of the time, the huge majority of the time. And what feeds into our subconscious is all these socio-cultural associations that become these strong beliefs that are our habits, so that we don't have to think when we see someone in a business suit, oh, that person is professional. We immediately, subconsciously, we make those associations. So, fashion and our subconscious, we may go to particular items of clothing because of our subconscious. Habits, anything that becomes automatic is subconscious, basically, until we bring it to our attention. And your second question, which you need to remind me of.
Oh, I'm just curious about how you see fashion playing a role in terms of just our narration of life. Like for instance, there's that book, Fashion and Aging. I don't know if you saw that book, talking about how fashion changes as we age.
Yeah.
And that's when we register our own kind of plot story, right? It's just
yeah. Well, don't get me started on fashion and aging, actually. Yeah. So I absolutely am not one for we should stop wearing this, that, or the other, and when we pass some kind of arbitrary milestone in our lives. But our bodies change usually, and that's not inevitable, but our bodies do change more or less as we age, and also our desire to be on trend or be part of the fashion movement of the time. I mean, you spoke about of the time. That is exactly what fashion is, of the time. We also become more confident as we get older. And there's a curve that shows that as we approach our 50s and 60s, we become more confident. That does begin to decline in older life. nevertheless, we become more confident. We care less about what people think about us. You know, that's an average. You know, you get variables on or variation on each end. But our narrative about using clothes, I think the more informed we are about the power of clothing, this is why I want to engage with fashion, not because I love fashion, which I do, but because I want to empower people to be the opposite of slaves to fashion, but to use fashion to make their lives better, to get the outcomes that they hope to get by being, I don't know, appropriate is probably not the right word, but doing some thinking, being conscious, really using fashion, because fashion is so powerful. It's such a perfect tool for, you know, making our lives better. And this doesn't need to involve, and I didn't get a chance to talk about any of this in the talk, but about not buying new. But what's new to us doesn't have to be brand new. So we can bring novelty by changing the vocabulary, you know, changing the syntax around, making a different sentence, you know, break up the paragraphs. I don't know if we're talking about it as language, but we can also, you know, there's so many different ways to engage with fashion now that are not buying new, that I think is finally people are engaging with really strongly now. And fashion brands have to take that on board, otherwise they're going to disappear. So yeah, it's our narrative in life, I think. Well, because it's so much of who we are, our identity. We show that through what we are. And I think there will soon be a time where buying new is like, I hope none of you are smokers, but if you are, I apologize, but buying new will be like smoking now. You know? Apologies to smokers.
Well, I like that. And I think that there's something beautiful about taking the body. And of course, when you're getting dressed, one of the most important registers is you're approaching your body through the lens of aesthetics. And you are paying attention to just the different kind of aesthetic features you have. And as you do that, you can't help but we talk about, you know, lifestyle, you know, the idea of style and lifestyle. And behind that is the idea that we all want to live a life that is beautiful. We want to live a life that has a certain kind of aesthetic quality and is appealing, not just to other people, but we want to know that about our own lives, that there's some kind of quality of beauty. And I think that part of that is the narration. One thing I didn't get into is I think our moods are deeply shifted based upon our understanding of where we're fitting within any given story. You know, how if there is a denouement, you know, like within your day you wake up. I used to teach in education theory. They would say in a class you have an hour, or during this graduate seminar, there's a certain amount of time, and in everybody's mind, there needs to be a certain kind of arc to this time. That's why you were so distraught that we lost you. And all of us were like, oh no, and is this class, are we be okay now, right? But we do that every day. And I think part of our dressing is we can't help but inscribe in the dressing process a story we're going to tell about ourselves during that day. And in many times, if you can only wear one outfit, right? That's one of the problems, is because you tend to change your outfit based upon social situation. And what are you going to do if you only can wear one outfit, you know, during that day? Then you tend to think about your narration, right? And so anyway, I just think that whole idea of narration is so important. And one of the reasons I think it's important, and I would just want to accent this, is I think narrative identity, which Paul Ricoeur was so good at, and understanding the self primarily as a storytelling creature, and that the way we think of ourselves and our identity is deeply embedded in the stories we tell about our lives, right? That to me is so deeply Christian. It's such a deeply theological impulse that we can't get away from story. And children, you know, you have to teach children logic, but they naturally love story because that's who we are as creatures. And my daughter, when she was a little girl, this is what started me writing this book, is one day when she was about 4, she came out of her room and she had taken a pillowcase and she had turned it into a gown. It was a pretty, like, it was just very sweet. You know, it wasn't, she actually wasn't even covering herself in the back. You see her little bum. hanging out, it was so endearing. And she was like, Dad, I'm a princess. I'm in my little room being a princess. So she was telling stories, and she wanted to create props in her life. Yeah. And her mood was so elevated by being able to have this prop on her body. Like you said, it's the closest thing we have to skin and the best way we have to shape our own selves.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I know when I dress up, sometimes the world's a little better now that I look a little nicer and I've showered and shaved and put on something,
Yeah. And our clothing has memories too. If we have clothes that we've had a great time in before, we were successful in, or we got a job when we wore this jacket to an interview or something, when we put that on again and remember that, that gives us power. And I think that's the wonderful part of it, the aesthetics, of course, because we know that we want to present our best selves. That's just a fundamental psychological need.
Yes. And I like what you said about it not need to be new. One of my favorite Christian philosophers is a man by the name of Calvin Searfield. And he talks about understanding style as the enchantment of everyday objects such that they have a depth and quality. And we can do that in the way we dress. We can approach dress in a way that is about power. You can, you want to have a certain kind of ascendancy or dominance, but you can also approach it kind of like I think with your denim shirt. I don't know. I don't want to read too much into it. You tell me. But, there's something that you want to let us know something about. That denim shirt, it has a certain kind of, there's all kinds of associations for you that are part of who you want to bring into this conversation. And we're all doing it.
Yeah.
At the time, we all made a choice to wear something. Even if we were to show up naked, that would be a choice and a statement. There is no neutral way here. We all have to continually narrate based upon the repository of what we have. And so I like that Searfield talks about not necessarily grabbing everything that's a fad, but that there is something about very intentionally kind of like inscripting our lives with objects that have a certain kind of enchantment because they are deeply imbibed in the stories that we are living.
Exactly.
There's something beautiful about that. And I would say that's a Christian impulse.
And I think we do that more as we get older as well. So, adolescents are more likely to be influenced by the latest fashion trend.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that we have 10 more minutes for discussion because of the technical issues we had earlier. So there is one more question from Patrick. Patrick, please.
Hi, thank you both. Really stimulating discussion. I wanted to ask about the role of sort of social media, and if our relation to fashion is mediated by social media, and it certainly is for a lot of young people. Social media impacts our mood and self-esteem and status anxiety and so on. So is there a risk that social media actually hinders the positive potential of fashion?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. A big risk. It can be an amazing platform for positivity. For example, the positive body movement that we've seen through social media, that the far less shaming around scars, for example, or size or ability, that kind of thing. But it can also be very, very damaging. The hidden sites, hidden from ordinary people who follow social listening, but people who want to find particular avenues for example, eating disorders that are in part, and I would say in part, I think it's quite important to say that, but in part triggered by fashion imagery, particularly when we see the editing tools and then the edits that we see on social media, not just the face edits, but also the body edits. You can stretch, you can grow, you can do all sorts of things. I mean, it's pretty amazing what you can do. But I'm savvy enough to know that this is an image and I don't want to be like that. But of course, other people, younger people, and not just younger people, people who are more vulnerable, let's say, or less confident, can be easily made to feel that they're not as good. They don't fit in. They can never achieve this kind of level of beauty, again in inverted commas here. And despite the now movement towards you must say when images have been edited, researchers found that even when this disclaimer is put on images or on a video, the damage is still done with a very, very brief exposure to images of very thin models, for example. We can feel worse about our body if that's what we aspire to be. And then, you know, people chase, and it's not only young women, it's increasingly men, and increasingly over the lifespan, people begin to chase an unattainable appearance because it's not real. And when you see the people in real life, they don't look like these images. And so it's kind of really damaging. It can be damaging, it can be good, but definitely can be damaging. Yeah.
Patrick, I'm curious. Thank you for that, Carolyn. I really agree with that. And Patrick, I'm curious. You know, usually questions come because somebody has some thinking behind it, and I'm just curious your answer to your question.
Sorry, you're curious about my thinking behind this?
Yeah, and if you have how you would answer your question.
I think it's an enormous societal question with no easy answer. You know, so it's a good question, but it's a very intractable sort of the dynamics at play in social media and so on. It's very hard to see how that. I mean, it is combated on sort of minor fronts, and there have been positive things, but there's certainly an enormous negative. You know.
Yeah, two of the parallels I see between fashion and social media. One is that both of them have had incredible political implications. Because they've created a new kind of space that transcends natural ways in which people typically have had power. And so, like the French Revolution in fashion, you know, is a whole study in itself. Many people believe that without fashion, it's hard to imagine the French Revolution happening. You know, Marie Antoinette, when she starts wearing knockoffs of her subjects, completely destroyed royal iconography, and it was no longer to imagine a being who was above yourself in ways you know, that you know, and that was closer to God than you, just simply by their blue blood. That it destroyed the royal iconography, but it also created a space in which there was a conversation. Coming back to fashion as communication, Carolyn, in which there was a conversation, a way of voting. There was an implicit suffrage that was taking place within the space of fashion. In the same way, social media kind of transcends natural ways in which political alignments happen. You know, and we can now kind of align ourselves with people in ways we never could before. And the Arab Spring might have been, you know, a result of that, but we're also seeing the way in which this can be twisted with those who are controlling that space in ways with big tech. So it's raising, you know, kind of similar problems. And then the other thing I think is that both of them deal with image and the way in which we present an image to the public. And one of the deep concerns throughout Christian thought is that there is a symmetry between the image I present and the person behind the image, and that the image is not, that there's sincerity and integrity, that I am who I am claiming to be. And one of the shocking things in my research is how deeply concerned theologians were historically with not bearing a false image, not breaking the commandment, right? Not deceiving, not lying. And that who you present yourself to be is actually who you are. And I think it goes beyond just simply former understandings of distributed justice. I think it actually goes to this issue of integrity. And it's something I think we all wrestle with, because we know we can present a self that isn't real on social media, or maybe just such a curated self that, you know, and we see it, and we all know this is the temptation out there. And it's, you know, so what does it look like to wear a habit today for a modern Christian who's maybe a Protestant that isn't, you know, Catholic and isn't part of a monastery, but wants to have a humility about their presence? You know, that's a Christian virtue, I think. So those are just a couple thoughts, Patrick.
I'd just like to
Thank you both.
add to that. Sorry, I mean, this is so interesting. Thank you, Robert. Yeah, that was so interesting listening to that. But I think we can also present ourselves in a way that is not our true self in real life. And fashion lets us do that. You know, fashion lets us, that's what cosmetics are. And now, you know, with cosmetic tweakments, people are having faces that are not their real faces. And, you know, with cosmetics, we can change how we look. The reason that people wear cosmetics is to enhance their features, to make their features look better, hopefully, than they did before. And we do that with our clothes. You know, we might wear clothes that have padded shoulders. So yeah, that's so interesting. That's an amazing question. I hadn't thought about that, but a great answer too from Robert. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, you know, you want to have spaces where you can play with the aesthetics, right? I mean, I think of a catwalk. People often judge a catwalk and say, well, this is crazy. Who would wear that?
Yeah.
That's the whole point of a catwalk is it's an art exploration, you know? They're just playing with things, you know? Let them play, you know? Don't make it just necessarily about, is it going to work on the street? And so, and I think there are spaces for us to sit in front of the mirror and think like, well, what if I, you know, I mean, I shaved my head. I used to have long hair down my back for years. I was a surfer. Everyone talked about my long blonde hair. It was my mark. And then one day I said, you know what? I'm going to go bald. I'll just shave it now. And, you know, and I just played with that and I was happy with the results. And so there is a place for us to be involved in our image. And yet, and this is where I think Christianity the Christian faith pushes against certain modern conceptions of identity as totally fluid, is that it teaches that identity is not only a construction, but it's also a gift that is to be received, and that there are limits to what we actually can or can't be, simply because if we think there's no limits, then we don't think there's any gift in our own identity. And so that is part of the mark of grace, is the idea that there is a God who gives us something, implies that there are things that need to be received and not just simply tampered with continuously, you know? So, and that's a huge issue today, you know? So,
yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sorry,
Carolyn, please go on.
It's so interesting, but I mean, and then so you say that's grace, but there's gratitude too, isn't it? It's gratitude. Yeah.
Yeah, I did have one question that was put forward, and we're running out of time, I guess.
Yes, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to say that since we have some more questions we want to discuss, we can stay a bit longer. But those of you who have to go, you can go. That's okay. We'll see you next week. Next week we'll be discussing music, but we'll just continue a little bit with some of you who still have questions. I know there are people like that. So please go on. Yes, Robert.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think I just wanted to just touch on this question that Carolyn asked me. The Christian God was supposed to be incarnate and therefore wore clothes. Does that make a difference to how Christians see clothing? And I love that question, Carolyn, and I just want to thank you for it. And I want to say it absolutely has a difference in how we see clothing. And in fact, we recognize that the gospel writers have very strategic ways. If you reread the gospel in terms of what Jesus wore when, it's so fascinating. So I just want to put that teaser out there. And one of my favorite Dutch theologians, who's kind of like the Bonhoeffer of the Netherlands, he talks about how, you know, Christ being stripped was so critical. It's actually the very central idea of the Christian faith, is that Christ was stripped so that we could be clothed. And there he's talking about the language of Christ showing us a God who comes to us in absolute and radical vulnerability and is placed kind of before us in all of that vulnerability in order for us to know that we are loved in ways that our greatest hopes and imaginations might point to. And so I'm just going to put that teaser out there. Of course, Jesus is swaddled. Jesus is given a crown of thorns. But there's theological intent within the gospel accounts of everything Jesus wore, and tracing it is a great joy. So I'm just going to put that out there as a teaser for anybody that will take that. And I don't know if that's going to be you, Patrick, or anybody else, but there's that.
Thank you very much. Yes, Nicole, you wanted to say something, or we can close the session.
Yeah, I mean, I just had a comment on something that has been touched previously, and then just when Carolyn was talking about the color red, I was thinking how much the color is also associated and as an important symbolism in the Catholic Church, and has been for a long time associated to the figure of the Pope. And actually, I was thinking about well, Ratzinger, and the fact that he has been hugely criticized for some of his fashion choices. And yeah, I just thought, yeah, it kind of connected with the earlier question about luxury items and how that connects. So I was thinking about the implication that, of course, this have in the church, and it is, of course, not something that is connected to our modern era, because that has been a huge issue for the Catholic Roman Church in previous history. So I just wanted to, it's more of a comment than than a question, and I wondered what was your take on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that people that criticize Ratzinger's approach understand Catholic political theology, and that it's very hard to see the state and the church in relationship as the Roman Catholic tradition does see it, namely that the church transcends the state and is a transnational kind of like independent entity that, unlike you have within Orthodox traditions where the church and the state are kind of deeply aligned, in the church in a certain sense is kind of within that national boundary. So if you're going to have the Vatican be its independent nation, you need to have a certain kind of status for the person that's the head that is going to make him an icon of the King of Kings. I mean, the Pope, when he sits in his throne, is an icon of Christ, the King of Kings. So he's not going to wear, t-shirt and jeans. It's not going to work for the imagination. So a lot of times these criticisms just come from people that don't really understand just the political theology behind it, and they're just thinking in terms of fashion as a consumer item, and luxury purely in terms of the way in which it's treated today.
And perhaps this links what Carolyn was saying about the language, and perhaps that sometimes as subjective language can be misunderstood. Yes, it's and just to say a word about that, another conversation we can have for another time is the depth and limits of fashion as a language. And Bernard does a phenomenal job in talking about the semiotics of dress. And what I conclude is that dress works oftentimes as a visual metaphor, and as all metaphors, it has fuzzy edges, which is both its power and its vulnerability. And so that's what means. That means we can make associations, but it also means those associations are not going to be precise, and there's always going to be certain kind of expectations, associations. Whereas with spoken word, you have like a certain rigidity to language that can have a precision, and so that's the charm of art, right? Is that art is a visual metaphor as well, and so fashion works on the same register.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I guess we can end it up here for now. Thank you all very much. It was really very interesting, and we recorded it all, so we'll upload it online. I'll definitely rewatch it once again. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.